Hi everyone. This is going to be my mini lecture on eating disorders and also disordered eating, unhealthy eating that doesn't qualify as a full-blown disorder because it's so common. So obesity is so common that about 2/3 of people in this country are either overweight or obese. As you probably know, our country is one of the worst in the world. I don't think we're number one anymore. I think Mexico has passed us. Australia and the United Kingdom are up there too. And even countries that India, for example, obesity is really increasing. It's increasing around the world. Within our country, one group of individuals that's particularly affected by obesity are the Pima Indians discussed in your textbook. Some fairly recent statistics shown here are that 64% of men and 75% of women are obese. Not just overweight. 2/3 of all of us are at least overweight. But actually 2/3 to 3/4 of them are obese, and almost 40% of them have diabetes. So they appear to be an ethnic group, maybe. I'll explain the skepticism in a minute. They appear to be an ethnic group that is particularly affected by obesity. Your textbook author explains that, and not just he, a lot of researchers believe that maybe a reason for this is that the traditional lifestyle of the Pima Indians really favored eating whenever they could on seasonally available foods, and then conserving energy as much as possible whenever they could. Now, here comes my skepticism. I'll get back to the Mexico versus Arizona. I'm not skeptical that that's true about the Pima Indians, that natural selection benefited those who ate as much as they could when they could, and conserved energy as much as they could when they had a chance to. But the thing is, I think that that's true for all of our ancestors. And of course, obesity is happening to us all. Note, if you've seen the movie WALL-E, this is a short little series of photos from it, showing the growth of obesity in modern life as people eat more and more and got lazier and lazier to where they wouldn't even walk. They just had these rolling chairs that they moved around in all the time. So there's absolutely a genetic predisposition in all of us to eat as much as we can and conserve energy as much as we can, because it was a really, really, really stupid hunter or gatherer who didn't eat when she had the opportunity to, or who went jogging when he wasn't actually chasing anything or nothing was chasing him. Those were both really stupid things for hunters and gatherers to do. So those who did that probably didn't become anyone's ancestors. Rather, the ones who pigged out when they could and were lazy when they could, those were a lot more reproductively successful hunter-gatherers. So this unhealthy trend that's happening to us all does seem to be happening a little more extremely to the Pima Indians. Probably one reason for that is that in our country, so in Arizona, but not in Mexico, see the last little bullet point there was a big, sad, and quick displacement in the late 1800s of the Pima Indians' homes, and in particular a disruption of their water source that they were able, before that, to use for farming. So waters were diverted for early Americans to use, and they could no longer use them. So the transition from a healthy, more ancestral diet to having to rely on store-bought foods came much more quickly to the Pima Indians than it did to the rest of us. But they really, I'm not convinced that they're extremely different genetically, especially since you don't see the same really high rates or disproportionately high rates of obesity in Pima Indians in Mexico like you do in Arizona. Basically, all of us are just doing exactly what a caveman or woman would do if he or she lived in this environment. If a caveman or woman lived in this environment and had the opportunity to drive through and get 3,000 calories without spending any, they would absolutely take that chance. Another specific factor in our modern society that has gotten a lot of blame for the obesity epidemic would be soft drinks. Probably with good reason. There's about 1 million studies out there demonstrating some link, sometimes causal, between soft drinks and obesity. So they are very high calorie, the regular ones, not the diet ones, although we'll talk about those too. And they don't fill you up. There's at least 2 reasons for why you can drink so many calories and not feel full. First of all, they have high fructose corn syrup in them, and the problem with that is that fructose is not glucose. Glucose is what your pancreas responds to by secreting insulin when it's in your bloodstream. And that rise in insulin is one thing that can make you feel full. If it's fructose, you don't get that filling effect, but the calories are still there. Also, anything that's liquid is just less filling calorie if you compare two substances that have the same amount of calories, and one is liquid and one is solid. The one that's liquid is always going to be rated, or usually going to be rated, as less filling by people who consume it. So you might think, all right, let's go to artificial sweeteners. Maybe, but there have been a number of reported problems there too. They're probably better than the sugary drinks, in my opinion. A number of studies, starting about 10 years ago, reported that extinction, here we mean Pavlovian conditioning extinction, of the normal predictive relationship between how sweet something is and how high calorie it is, could be caused by consuming diet sodas. So when you consume a diet soda or anything with artificial sweeteners, it can be very sweet but actually have no calories, and maybe that caused an unhealthy type of learning, or extinction of learning really, where people no longer felt full even when they ate real sugar. I've got a question mark there, because there have been a lot of failures to replicate the finding that artificial sweeteners cause weight gain, including a bunch of really sad, funded with grant money, but that's why they're sad, sad ones in my own laboratory. Another possible way in which artificial sweeteners might contribute to obesity is by disrupting healthy gut microbes or gut bacteria. And sometimes the disruption of gut bacteria can lead to obesity. Studies with mice have found that by transplanting gut microbes from fat mice into skinny mice, you can make the skinny mice fat. In mice, it's pretty easy to transfer gut microbes because they readily eat each other's feces anyway. People, not so much, hopefully. So there is a movement out there to transfer, a fecal transfer or fecal transplant movement. You can actually sell your feces online, and people will buy it. And so the idea for treating a number of conditions, including obesity — I don't think this is very popular for obesity — is that you need to get the microbes in someone else's feces into your own intestines, not by eating them, but rather with some sort of an enema. If you don't like that, which you probably don't, there is also bariatric surgery. There's different types. It can be a gastric bypass, as described in your text. It can be some kind of stomach stapling, or a cuff, or a balloon inserted into the stomach. The idea is anything that makes the stomach fill more quickly, in theory, should send signals up your vagus nerve to your PVN, paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus, and that should make you feel full. Bariatric surgery does work. However, most people who undergo it were very large to start with, and they remain large. Not as large, but it doesn't take someone from morbidly obese to normal weight, typically. The next, not just disordered eating, but full-blown disorder I want to talk about is bulimia. Bulimia is, sure enough, characterized by binging and purging. And it's been described, interesting research has been done on it, comparing it to drug addiction. So this research involved giving hungry rats access to something that they absolutely loved, which was really sugary syrup, when they were really hungry. And they would eat a ton of it, or drink a ton of it. And then they would be made really hungry again, and then they would get access to the syrup again, and it would cycle for a few days. And then they would skip a dose of their sugary syrup that they loved. And when that happened, they didn't act hungry. A hungry rat acts like a hungry dog. It begs. It tries to get your attention. It forages through its cage looking for little crumbs. It acts like it's searching for food. These rats that had been accustomed to this delicious sugary syrup when they were hungry acted more like they were in withdrawal. Their teeth chattered, they shook, they got diarrhea, they sat in the corner all hunched up. They acted exactly like a mouse or a rat going through morphine or heroin withdrawal. And that withdrawal state could be relieved by giving the rats the sugary syrup they wanted or by administering morphine, suggesting that at least in some cases, at least in the case where it's a very rich food that you repeatedly consume when you're very, very hungry, the food can become similar to drugs in terms of dopamine and opioid release. That may be even more true for binge eating disorder than it is for bulimia. Binge eating disorder didn't get a heading in your textbook, but it's simply defined as eating much more than a normal person would in a single setting and feeling some source of shame or distress or secrecy about it. This also looks like food addiction, and some studies suggest that the food addiction that may apply to bulimia may apply even more strongly to binge eating disorder. Then there's anorexia. Anorexia is described simply as refusing to eat enough to maintain a healthy weight, even when food is available. Remember earlier in your eating module of this chapter, there was a stage of rat recovery from brain damage from lateral hypothalamus damage that was described as anorexia simply because the rats refused to eat enough to stay alive. That term anorexia, when applied to rats, probably isn't the greatest model of human anorexia. Something that goes way beyond the scope of this class, but matters a lot, but would be discussed more in other courses, is the idea of internalizing a thin ideal, and the exposure we have to really skinny models in magazines has been shown sometimes in cause and effect studies where they actually purposely give out subscriptions to young women that are magazine subscriptions that are full of skinny women, and sure enough, that doesn't seem to help body image and sometimes can lead to symptoms of anorexia. But for a more biological, that's going to be biological, right? Because it's brain information processing. But for a more obviously biological explanation, and one discussed in your text, let's look at activity-based anorexia. The idea here is that maybe the weight loss itself is the problem. Maybe originally losing too much weight to begin with caused the anorexia instead of anorexia causing the problem. Because as your textbook author points out, it's hard to see anything wrong with someone with anorexia other than the weight loss. They may be a little depressed, it doesn't really seem to run in their families, there doesn't seem to be anything really strange about brain activity or body chemistry, certainly nothing that preceded the illness, not enough to explain the illness. So the idea is sometimes the weight loss itself can trigger symptoms of anorexia. This is studied in rats with a paradigm called activity-based anorexia. Activity-based anorexia is rats have limited access to food. They have all the food they want, actually, but only for 1 or 2 hours a day, one in the study cited in your textbook. And for the rest of the time, they have access to a running wheel. They run on the wheel for many hours a day, especially if the room is a little bit cold, because it warms them up. And so if they run all the time to stay warm and they can't eat all the time, well, then they lose weight. But they don't just lose weight, they lose more weight than they have to. These rats will stop eating even while the food is available. So they mimic the definition of anorexia, which is refusing to eat enough to stay healthy even when food is available. This activity-based anorexia procedure in rats works better, not only, but it works better if the room is cold, because that kind of motivates the rats to run to stay warm. And as pointed out in your text, some recent treatments for anorexia in people actually involve keeping them warm. A little bit of the motivation to move and burn calories, and it seems to actually be to warm the person up. And it's not by itself a cure for anorexia. Other factors or other aspects of the treatment are described in your text, like encouraging eating, but simply keeping the person warm has been helpful, and help simply keeping the rat warm, like by putting a warm place in its cage, will sometimes prevent the activity-based anorexia in research rats.